Okay, welcome everyone to what I think is one of the final sessions of the Future Law Virtual Summit. And it's really central to what we're trying to do going forward post-summit. I have with me here Ms. Jojo Mehta, one of the founders of the Stop Ecocide movement and now leading the movement, and also Ms. Kate Macintosh, who heads the Promise Institute for Human Rights at the UCLA, and who is also one of the lawyers working on the crafting of this new law in respect of ecocide, which I think it's going to be a really fascinating discussion that I hope lawyers around the world can learn a lot from, because I remember when I first started talking to you about it, Jojo, you had to explain quite a bit to me about the framework that was being used to address ecocide. So welcome guys to this discussion. Kate, I'd like to go to you first, and maybe you can, more fully introduce yourself as well. We are looking at how do we prevent or scale back this environmental damage that is taking place at the behest of corporations and their actions on the planet. What is ecocide, and why is ecocide a relevant avenue to be pursued?
Thanks, Margaret, and hi everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you and Jojo. So maybe just to introduce myself briefly then. So I'm at the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA School of Law here in Los Angeles, as Margaret said, which is a new position for me. I arrived 2 years ago to set up the Institute. And one of the things that we're focusing on is human rights and the environment. And within that, this thinking about ecocide is really my driving motivation to push that forward. Always one of the strategies I think is most effective and that we can most effectively contribute to in terms of trying to halt the climate crisis. I have a history of working in international criminal justice for many years at the Yugoslavia and Rwanda tribunals. I also worked in human rights in many different capacities, in post-conflict operations, and I've also worked in humanitarian assistance. I worked with MSF, or Doctors Without Borders, for many years, based at their headquarters in Amsterdam. So ecocide then would be to introduce to international criminal law a crime of committing massive harm on the environment. And what that really means is to recognise that what we're doing to our environment and our planet is of a piece and is on the same level as other things that have been lifted to the level of international crimes. So international crimes at the moment include genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And there's also the crime of aggression. Different history, but basically crimes which are seen to be so heinous and so egregious that they're not just a crime against the individual victims, they're actually a crime against all of us. That's the basic philosophy behind international criminal law. And I think it becomes apparent, just from me framing it like that, why it makes sense for destruction of our environment to be treated on that level. I mean, it's the ultimate transnational crime, and it does actually threaten our existence. And so just on an intuitive moral level, it makes sense to introduce a crime of ecocide, or to have destruction of our environment, the environment in which we live, in which we're able to live with dignity, to the same level as other crimes against humanity, which are attacks on a civilian population which significantly harm their survival or their ability to live in dignity. So that's it in a nutshell. The idea is to raise serious environmental damage to the level of these other core international crimes, which are crimes against everybody.
And you said that you think that it is one of the most effective strategies, or an effective strategy for dealing with corporate environmental damage. Why do you say so? Why do you say it is the most effective strategy that we could pursue?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say that it's clearly not a silver bullet. I don't think any of us are suggesting that making ecocide a crime is going to solve the climate crisis. I mean, it's a small piece of the puzzle, but it's a missing piece of the puzzle, and I think it's an essential piece of the puzzle. So the thing about international criminal law, first of all, it's individual criminal responsibility. So you've been talking about corporate responsibility, Margaret, obviously because we know, who are the big drivers behind climate change. But this would not be about fining large corporations. And we've seen how ineffective fining large corporations is in having any significant difference or making any impact. This is about individual criminal responsibility. So if ecocide were to become an international crime, the individuals such as board members or CEOs of these companies would be personally responsible and could themselves be imprisoned or face other penal sanctions for what they've done. So in my opinion, that is something which really might have an impact in the boardroom. I mean, we've seen how these enormous, mega wealthy companies deal with the threat of legal action. I mean, it just doesn't seem to have much impact on their strategy. I do think that making individuals criminally responsible could shift that conversation and make it really become, a serious risk that the company then tries to avoid. The other major advantage about international criminal law is because of this character of being seen as a crime erga omnes, or a crime against everyone, it can be prosecuted anywhere. So we're seeing at the moment, for example, some war crimes or genocide that are accused, that are alleged against Syrian individuals being prosecuted, for example, in Germany. We've seen other perpetrators of international crimes prosecuted in other domestic jurisdictions, in other words, not in their own country and not in the country where the crime occurred, because it's one of these crimes that's a crime against everybody. So if ecocide were to become an international crime, first of all, there's the question of the International Criminal Court as a forum to prosecute, of course, but anyway, any state would be able to prosecute somebody for ecocide once it becomes an international crime, as it is with genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity. So that's a very, very powerful tool, especially because a lot of the worst environmental damage happens in very weak states, where the likelihood of prosecution is low, usually because the company concerned is extremely powerful in that state, and the annual profits of the company will outweigh the country's GDP, for example. And then the third thing I'd say about why international criminal law is this missing piece of the puzzle that would be, I think, really effective if we could introduce it, is the kind of legal action that we see happening, and there's some amazing and effective lawsuits that are going on around the world, and it's really creative, but they rely on victims bringing the case, right? These are civil lawsuits. So that relies on the victims being able to fund a case for a start. And of course, as we know, who is the most affected by this kind of by environmental damage? Of course, it's marginalized, dispossessed people living in poverty around the world. I mean, we've seen that play out time and time again. The people who are least likely to have the resources to be able to pursue any legal action against their violators. With international criminal law, that takes that out of the hands of the victims and puts the responsibility on states and the international community to prosecute these crimes. So for those three reasons, I think it seems to me obvious on a moral and intuitive level that destroying our planet should be an international crime. But I also think that it's a strategically useful tool in the battle against the climate crisis.
Thanks, Kate. And why pursue this at the international level only? Have any national jurisdictions recognized? Where's Kate? I'm not seeing Kate. Have any nation states recognize ecocide in their local laws?
Well,
actually, is that another way it can be approached?
Yeah, absolutely. That's another way it can be approached. There are actually, I think, 10 states that have ecocide in their national criminal law. These are all 9 former Soviet republics and Vietnam. I don't think it's hugely used. I haven't seen that's been, this dates from a long time ago. I haven't seen that that's been particularly effective, but they have a definition which they've pulled together of ecocide in their national criminal laws. But that is helpful because it shows that it already exists in law. So that's definitely helpful for a campaign to introduce ecocide. As to, you know, what we would want to achieve with making ecocide an international crime, I mean, you know, as you know, Margaret, the whole system of international criminal law, and especially around the International Criminal Court, although there is a court which can try these crimes if the state, which normally has jurisdiction, is unwilling or unable to prosecute, the whole philosophy around the Rome Statute system, the International Criminal Court system, is that states sign up to prosecute those crimes domestically themselves. And, you know, that is also, I mean, that's more effective than leaving everything to an international court for a number of reasons. The most obvious one is resources. International courts, you know, we've seen that they're not able to prosecute all the crimes in their jurisdiction and have to be very selective. But also because it's often more impactful, actually, for something to be prosecuted nearer to where it happened. So that's the system. So if it were possible to introduce the crime of ecocide, or maybe I should say when the crime of ecocide is introduced to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, what that will mean is that states who are parties to the statute and who accept that amendment will be able to prosecute that crime automatically in their own national courts. So there'll always be complementarity, and that's actually the philosophy of the Rome Statute. But the other thing, just to repeat what I said earlier, is that once it's become an international crime, it can be prosecuted domestically in any state, no matter where the crime was committed. And that to me is almost the most important element of this, because it means that we can see accountability for crimes that are committed in weak states where the population has very, very little redress. We can see accountability in other parts of the world.
Thanks, Kate, for that. And I want to bring you in onto the discussion now, Jojo. You, along with Polly Higgins, started this movement for Stop Ecocide. Could you tell us a little more about how that started and where you're at, how you've progressed this movement so far?
Absolutely. So I first met Polly in 2014, and she had already been kind of crusading, if you like, on this issue for several years. She had this sort of realization that the earth needed protection in the same way as the clients that she was seeing in her court, and actually when she sort of stepped out of a very successful career as a barrister to pursue particularly this. And what she discovered was, in fact, that when the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court was being discussed in its draft stages, there were originally plans to include serious environmental crimes in that statute, but they didn't make it to the final draft. So when she started looking into this, she realized that it was quite literally a missing crime, you know, one that had apparently intended to be in there. And so she then focused the last 10 years of her life on promoting this concept and actually starting to kind of move it forward at the international level to bring that back into question on the international level. And we actually met through, she was doing some work around a case about fracking. And I was involved in the anti-fracking community. So I came to this from the campaigning side. And that I was sort of deeply involved with that very on the ground kind of grassroots activism. And I came to it from that side. And we started working together in 2014. And over those sort of initial couple of years where we worked almost in parallel, where we kind of supported each other, but weren't publicly working together. And what Polly was finding was that it was very difficult to get support for this work. It was considered quite left field and extreme. And it was also very difficult because when the work that you're doing is kind of on a diplomatic level, in the sense that, you know, you're engaging in conversations with politicians, you know, a lot of the developments that were happening were kind of, you know, were not publicly disclosable at any one moment. So, you know, trying to get sort of large foundations to support this, it felt both risky and difficult to pin down, because it was, you know, it was very much, it was very unpredictable. And in the end, we ended up realizing that there needed to be a public campaign, because, as I think, you know, Kate expressed with this kind of moral aspect, if you stop someone on the street even and talk about the level of destruction that is going on to our environment around the world and ask them whether they think it's criminal, they'll tell you yes. I've yet to have someone not say yes to that question. And yet it's not actually a crime. So at the kind of grassroots level of interacting with people, we knew that there was the support was there at the public level. And so it was about putting together the legal aspects and the campaigning aspect and creating a campaign that people could get behind. And that was where we were coming from in terms of doing that. And it actually allowed us to raise enough funds for Polly and a team of international diplomatic contacts and lawyers to start making the contacts at the International Criminal Court, but also with particular states to start moving this forward. And so that was the kind of origins of the campaign. And very sadly, Polly has not lived to see the acceleration that is happening now, because she sadly departed last year after a very short, aggressive cancer. But certainly I'd say her spirit is with us, because this is really progressing fast now.
It's really progressing fast now. Can you take us a little behind the scenes? What is the process for getting an offense like this onto the International Court?
So the process for actually amending the Rome Statute has 4 steps to it. And it's quite straightforward in the sense that these steps are very simply laid out. And the first is proposal. A state that is a member of the International Criminal Court, and that can be any state member, can propose an amendment to add the crime of ecocide, for example. And then that has to be done with at least a 3-month space until the next annual meeting of the ICC. And those normally happen in December every year. And then the second stage would be at that next meeting, where a simple majority of those present and voting has to accept that this is admissible. In other words, this is on the table, it's now, up for discussion. So that's the second stage. The third stage is the meat of it, which is about, when the actual exact wording of the amendment is agreed upon and states, contribute to that discussion and so on. I mean, the last time the Rome Statute was amended, which was with crimes of aggression, there was a dedicated conference with state parties present and so on to work out how that agreement would evolve and come out with a definition and amendment that states could move forward with, and that it could be adopted into the statute. And you need 2/3 of members of the ICC to take, for that to actually go into the statute, for that to be adopted into the statute. And at that point, it is a crime, effectively. It's become an international crime. It then, of course, has to be ratified by the member states, and that's a process that happens over time. You may end up with a number of states ratifying immediately and others coming afterwards, very much as happened with the Paris Agreement, for example. So that's that's the overall process.
And where are we in the
process? Where are we in the process?
Yeah.
So really, we're kind of just before the first stage, I would say, in the sense that the probably 3 years leading up to last December were background work, particularly from our perspective, with a lot of dialogue with small climate vulnerable states, in particular Vanuatu, which was the first sovereign state to announce at the ICC, at the International Criminal Court. That was last December, 2019. And of course, that was their decision to do that, to have that courage to stand up and say, we want this to be seriously considered. So it was really raising it and putting it onto the table again at the international level. But there was sort of 3 years of advocacy work behind getting to that point. And in fact, we've been, our campaign specifically raised funds to enable us to bring delegates from the Pacific to the ICC. I mean, it's all very easy for European states or big wealthy states to attend those meetings. But for small island states on the other side of the world, for whom those international crimes which are already in place were perhaps not felt to be so relevant, there's a whole kind of piece of work around, information and advocacy and having a kind of sense that a crime of ecocide could help those states in the sense that, the destruction of the environment and the exacerbation of climate change thereby is hugely relevant to them. And so a lot of that work was in, bringing that whole conversation into being and, enabling them to have a voice in that, which they courageously took and decided to stand up and actually speak out at last December. And that was followed rapidly by the Maldives, another small island state, which already had quite an interesting reputation in terms of bringing attention to their climate predicament. I don't know if you remember, they held a cabinet meeting underwater a few years ago. And so there was a kind of strong sense of, being happy to speak out about that. So the fact that they then joined Vanuatu in that call was yeah, we understood how that happened, and
right.
we helped them to be there too. So so that was very exciting.
Right. So we've had a couple states, vulnerable states, make the call.
Yeah.
And
where are we now?
Yeah.
So this is the last year has been extraordinary really for us, because in fact, just before that happened, the first head of state, so to speak, who spoke out about ecocide crime was actually the Pope Francis, who obviously is head of the Vatican, and also the head of the Roman Catholic Church, which in its adherence across the world is a huge percentage of the world's population. So that was a very powerful voice to speak out for ecocide crime. And he called for it using actually the definition, the working definition that Polly Higgins had submitted to the International Law Commission back in 2010,
right.
Which is essentially extensive loss, damage and destruction of an ecosystem or ecosystems, so that the inhabitants can no longer live, as Kate was saying, in peace and dignity. And he did that in November last year. So then close on the heels of that came the ICC meeting in Vanuatu. And then this year, we've actually seen European heads of state and governments starting to talk about this. So in France, in June, we saw the results of a citizens' assembly. Now, this was an interesting situation because, as you'll no doubt recall, the French government tried to introduce some measures.
So this is June 2020?
This is June 2020, so really quite recent.
COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it was amazing to watch this happening, actually, because the citizens' assembly that recommended to the government to legislate for ecocide, even just the practicalities of that happening under COVID were amazing, that they actually managed to bring that together and do that. And that assembly was a response to the Gilets jaunes situation the previous year, where fuel taxes had been introduced in France, and this was hugely unpopular. And so the government almost ended up saying, if you don't like our climate policies, let's do a citizens' assembly, give us some ideas. And what came out top, out of 149 recommendations, was legislate for ecocide. Wow. Which was phenomenal. And it really shows, I mean, for me, coming from the campaigning perspective into this arena, really realizing how that interaction between the legal side, the governmental side, and the popular opinion and the grassroots side really interplays, because it was that climate assembly that kind of pushed Macron into having to make a statement in support, and he did that and said he'd support it at the international level. So that was a huge step again in the conversation, which then rolled on to Belgium, where there was a bill submitted to Parliament in July, and that's now evolved into the new government proposals in Belgium, where they've got a new government now as of literally a couple of weeks ago. It took them a long time to form it. And in their government pledges, they actually state that the government will take diplomatic action to halt ecocide crime. And then most recently, two parliamentary motions have been submitted also in Sweden by 3 different political parties. So this conversation is really starting to grow right now. It's very exciting.
That's exciting. And you said that the ICC met, you want to come join, Anya? You said that the ICC meets in December every year. Any plans for the one coming up?
Okay, so it's a bit of a special case this year, as you can probably imagine, because of COVID. Hi, Anya.
Good to meet you finally.
Lovely to see you. So there will be, as far as we know, there will be an assembly, but unlike the usual situation, civil society won't be able to participate. So we would normally hold specific side events within that context, but we won't be able to do that this year because of COVID. So they will be going through specific official business, to the best of our understanding, and other business will be pushed forward to either to next year's assembly or to another point next year as yet. unconfirmed.
Right.
So, but what we are engaging in this year, and I think on the legal and diplomatic side, this is hugely important, and Kate is directly involved in this, is that we've been invited by parliamentarians, and there's more than one country now interested in this, to convene an expert panel of international criminal lawyers and environmental lawyers to draw up a clear and robust, legally robust definition of ecocide that can actually be used by states to potentially consider for proposing to the ICC. And that's a kind of, that's a huge step in the sense that there have been definitions in the past. There's been Polly Higgins' definition. There was a group of lawyers based in France that also did quite a detailed definition a while back. But in a sense, it's like that's you know, a bunch of lawyers saying, yes, we think this is a great idea and this is what it should look like. But it's a completely different ballpark when you've got state actors saying, you know, parliamentarians saying, we actually want to look at something we might be able to use, and, you know, and that's actually potentially acceptable to states as diverse as Sweden, Belgium, and Vanuatu, for example. So that's a hugely exciting development, and that's what we're concentrating on this year, given that we can't actually, you know, progress directly at the Assembly this year.
I hear you. I would love to bring Kate back in at this time to tell us a little bit about that process, where you are in that process about drafting the new definition for ecocide, and how is that going?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's funny, as Jojo says, there have been many definitions. It's actually quite difficult to craft a definition which within the parameters of international criminal law, because as Jojo also highlighted, we're at the point now where, you know, we need to get serious, and where it's obvious that the moment is now, right? These political developments that Jojo has been highlighting are suddenly happening, and it's really interesting to watch that happen. And I mean, I've seen that happen in other fields. You know, there's an idea which seems like way out there, and suddenly it starts kind of landing and getting purchased, and you're not entirely sure why, but you realize, like, okay, this is the moment, you know, we have to move now. And in order to really move forward and make this a reality, we have to come up with a definition which is really legally robust and which is understood to be a sensible, credible definition by international lawyers and government legal advisors. So I think Jojo's initiative is, you know, has come at exactly the right moment. And I mean, we actually had a similar initiative at the Promise Institute, which is folding now into Jojo's initiative. But it seemed to me that the most useful thing that I could do as an international lawyer based at a university was to engage, you know, well-respected, kind of prestigious international lawyers and academics in really hammering out a definition. And that's exactly what, you know, Jojo had the same realization and invited me to join the panel, which is great, because I will also bring the work of the expert group that we have at Promise. But as I was saying, it's not that we can just think, what do we think should be illegal and suggest that as a crime. You know, it doesn't work like that. It has to be crafted within the existing parameters of international criminal law in order for it to be plausible. I mean, if you look at the Rome Statute, for example, of the International Criminal Court, you know, that was drawn up at a conference in Rome, but the basic premise was that governments were codifying things that were already prohibited under customary or treaty international law. So, you know, that's the way international law progresses, right? I mean, I don't know if it's all international lawyers on the call or not, but for those that aren't, that's what happens. I mean, things don't just kind of land to people like, let's go with this, it sounds like a good idea. You have to convince states that basically everyone pretty much agrees this is already a crime. We can see that from the way they've been acting and from the way they've been, you know, prosecuting and the way they've been handling their policies. And now is the moment to capture this in a treaty, which everybody can sign up to and agree. So it's very important to make sure that we present something that fulfills those criteria so that it will really be taken seriously. And so that's what we're engaged in now. I mean, the panel with Jojo is yet to officially launch. I think she's still putting together the final panel members, At Promise, we've been doing work which will fold into this, as I say, which essentially includes, you know, we've had like a day-long workshop, we've written a report, we've done kind of online symposium, getting lawyers to address different aspects, different kind of tricky aspects of crafting this. So to give you a couple of examples, as this is a legal conference, I guess there's people who's interested in the law listening. So some of the difficult things, for example, are the causation and impact, right? So if you think about something like genocide or crimes against humanity, the acts are defined as, you know, there's a threshold criteria. Genocide has to be with the intent to destroy a specific group. Crimes against humanity are widespread and systematic attacks against the civilian population. But the acts are things like murder, you know, torture, extermination, deportation. The harm is immediate. You can see what's, you know, actors are doing things to populations and harming them immediately. And with the destruction of the environment, that's not necessarily the case. I mean, it may be in some cases, for example, of appalling poisoning, you know, like the Cerro de Pasco mines in Peru, or those kind of situations where you can see some immediate physical impact on the population. But if we start thinking about climate change, I think it's obvious that that's much more complicated. Like which acts, you know, which acts are going to be criminalized. We know what the drivers of climate change are. We know about emissions. We know that fossil fuels and deforestation are the causes, but which acts in contributing to deforestation, which actors, which kind of fossil fuel, is it, you know, is it the mining, is it the extraction, is it the refining, is it the combustion? Are we talking about holding airlines responsible, or are we looking at carbon majors? Where's the line? All of these questions are really complex. So it needs some really hard thinking to look at that, and it needs some innovation, actually. I mean, it has to be within existing parameters, as I said, but there needs to be a lot of creativity to translate this different type of crime, where the effects are much more long-lasting and where it's much harder to trace one particular impact back to one particular action. It needs a lot of creativity to think about how that can be captured with the tools that we have. So that's really what the panel to be working on, and you know, it's fun, it's difficult, but it's really important.
Yeah, it sounds like the kind of thing that, you know, young lawyers and all lawyers would want to get their teeth into. But let me push back a little bit on you. How long is this going to take? All this innovation and, you know, complexity.
So yeah, that was, I mean, our intention.
I'm talking firstly about the panel, though.
Yeah, no, I know.
Once it's constituted, how long do you think it will take to come up with the definition?
And we're kind of aiming up for a few months, I think. But obviously, nobody's done this before.
I know.
so you know, we're kind of on the leading edge here. But the aim is to have something by the spring. So yeah,
it's not that. I mean, it's not impossible. I didn't mean to give that impression. It's difficult, but we've already made progress, right? So we've written. I mean, we have an online symposium with people dealing with exactly those issues. We've got, you know, we invited people to think about different elements and blog about it. We've already outlined what the challenges are. There are many things we can draw on. I mean, just to give one little legal nerdy example, crimes against humanity. In the Rome Statute, crimes against humanity, there are enumerated different types of ways in which, you know, crimes against humanity can be committed. And I mentioned extermination and deportation. Interestingly, the crime of apartheid is there. That's long established as an international crime and as a crime against humanity. But if you think about it, the crime of apartheid is a system. So we have a precedent for a systemic crime already in international criminal law. Now, the crime of apartheid hasn't been prosecuted as a crime against humanity, right? So it may be that many of those things haven't been thought out, but in the same way that the crime of apartheid is a system, but we know it was accompanied by extreme physical violence. And in fact, that would have been a necessity in order to perpetuate that system. If we look at things around climate change and environmental destruction, we can look at emissions and global warming, but actually there's almost always these actions, these massive acts of environmental destruction, almost always accompanied by physical violence. So there will be environmental protesters who are murdered. There will be populations who are forcibly displaced from their land. So, you know, there are elements there of the more traditional elements of international crimes, I think, within any kind of environmental destruction. It's just trying to craft something that really captures the act that we see as most destructive and criminal towards us. And so it's not impossible. I think we'll come up with something workable relatively soon.
I'm sure. I was just teasing, especially with you in there, Kate. And so Kate is here, and the panel will be dealing with the legal challenge and the defining of it in that way. You already spearheading the political challenge, yeah? How do you get states to agree to put this onto the books? Are you taking steps in parallel right now? And what do you need?
Well, I think one of the key things that we need to look at in this arena, I guess, is narrative. Because legally speaking, there are probably a number of ways to approach making protection of the environment stronger and so on. And there are arguments for adapting, for example, crimes against humanity and some aspects of the law that's already in place, as Kate was talking about. But in order to create a level of pressure that is needed for governments to realize that something needs to be done, I mean, actually there is now, I mean, and I would say this is largely due to the civil mobilization we've seen over the last year and a half. So Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, the school strikes and so on. Those movements have sort of widened the window of conversation on the political level. They've actually, they've kind of created enough furore around the climate and ecological emergency to enable the narrative around strong protections of the environment to start landing in the political arena. So while, you know, Polly and I were talking about this for years, and other people had also, you know, associates of ours in France and Sweden and elsewhere had been having this conversation for a number of years, it's only recently that it's actually being heard. And that is, I would say, directly to do with the level of civil mobilization that we've seen. It's kind of shifted that window. But the important thing for moving the conversation on is a kind of narrative that the grassroots can get behind, and that potentially NGOs and other actors, whether it's influencers, whether it's also spiritual leaders, for example, we're looking at the Pope, and we also have recent meetings with Indigenous Original Nations elders, also who, you know, really kind of understanding that something very serious is needed to be put in place. And ecocide, just even as a word, has a kind of power to it that simply adapting another rule doesn't have when you're having that conversation on the campaigning level.
Right.
And so that expanding that narrative and expanding that conversation is really our kind of key drive at the moment.
Okay.
You know, we're aware that, you know, I think we're all aware that there isn't time to mess around on this. This is one of the reasons that we're going for the International Criminal Court, because as Kate says, it accesses all the jurisdictions, the criminal jurisdictions that already exist. But we also, you know, we don't have time to expect everybody to necessarily get on board and sign up with our specific campaign, but we do have time to make the conversation around ecocide loud enough that the work that we're doing then, perhaps behind the scenes or at the advocacy level with politicians, is landing, because that conversation is live. And so that's actually the most important thing in terms of, you know, people talking about ecocide, the concept of ecocide as mass damage and destruction. You know, we may not have the final definition until, well, obviously we'll have a proposable definition when we've finished with the deliberations of the panel, and we also have kind of various working definitions, but until it's actually in the statute, it won't be a word-for-word definition. But the concept is powerful in itself, and that's what's kind of bringing it forward right now, is this sense of the scale of what is happening and putting a word to that. You know, ecocide as a crime, like homicide, like genocide, you know, and this is in different positions, is in different stages of development in different parts of the world. So, you know, in France, you know, you can say Ecocide to anybody on the street and they'll know what you're talking about, pretty much. You know, it's much further advanced there than it is, say, in the UK or, you know, elsewhere. I mean, you know, other countries are kind of approaching that, but then some, I mean, I don't know what Kate's experience is in the US, but certainly I often find when speaking with people in the US, you know, I get this kind of echo what, you know, because it's not yet in the vocabulary. So it's about building that conversation.
I was about to ask you, how do you translate that into numerous different languages? I mean, we do have language barriers, and ecocide comes out of the possibly English suicide, right? Do you have different translations in different languages already, or is that something yet to emerge?
Well, interestingly, I mean, it translates very easily into the Latin type languages, so ecocidio or ecocidio, you know, so that you're covering already the next biggest, you know, most spoken language in the world, Spanish, and then obviously Portuguese, Italian, and so on as well, French, all of those languages. In the Germanic languages as well, they say Ecocide, I think. So there's something, you know, it seems to have quite an intuitive translation into a number of well-used languages. You know, we're interestingly just starting to get into this territory because we've recently launched an international petition on our website. So we have a website, stopecocide.earth, which is our key website. We also have sites in a number of different languages already: Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, and French and Italian coming soon. But what we do have is a sign-up process that is already in 8 languages and will very quickly have more. So we will end up with, I mean, we've already got kind of Serbian and Swahili in the pipeline, you know, and Hindi as well. You know, they're not yet on there, but so it will become easier and easier, I think, for people to have somewhere to go to that they can actually go, yeah, I support this in my language. So that's going to be an exciting development that's already just starting now. So
yeah. And so you're approaching it at the, you know, ICC level. Are you doing anything to build this narrative from the bottom up as well? Yes, you have this website. And what about support for policy entrepreneurship from the bottom up? Because if we could have, I think, a movement of policy entrepreneurs around the world trying to advance it, not necessarily at ICC, but in their
own countries.
Right.
Yeah, and this all helps. Of course it does. I mean, you know, we tend to aim specifically for the ICC, but what we encourage is for everyone in their own countries to, and politically this is very interesting because what we encourage is for people to pressure their governments to the point that, say, Macron was at, which is that they would support it at the international level. Now, obviously, we would never try and dissuade anyone from taking it forward at the national level, of course. But what we've realized from our experience over the last couple of years, particularly, is that states are very wary of trying to progress this on their own. It feels very risky. They've got already kind of embedded relationships with certain, you know, economic relationships with big businesses, or, you know, all these kinds of considerations. And also, you know, potentially, you know, they may perceive it as losing international competitiveness if they suddenly say that they can't do certain activities. So there's this kind of wariness around going it alone. And so what we encourage is for states to say, you know, to basically say, yes, we'll support this if others do it. Effectively, it's a kind of conditional commitment, if you like. And that's what Macron did. And, you know, we believe that's likely to be the sort of safest political approach. But it's also, interestingly, ultimately the most effective, because actually, if everybody does agree to move forward on this internationally, you know, okay, states don't have to be afraid of having to do something tomorrow, but at the same time, once it is moving, it's moving with a lot of people together, and therefore it has that much more impetus. So politically, you know, that's what we would encourage people in their individual jurisdictions to push for. Will you support this? If this happens, you know, if this happens at the international level, are you gonna join in? You know, so it's a question of joining in rather than feeling like you have to stick your neck out. Yeah. So politically, that's the kind of angle that we're taking with it. And I think that can be taken up by people in a number of different arenas. Yes. And I mean, one of the things we've been recently hearing actually from people who were at Davos last year, for example, is that, you know, corporates are actually calling out for the right kind of regulation. They're almost saying, give us the parameters and we'll work to it. We know something needs to be done. You know, so this is, you know, there's even a way where this is a kind of a course correction particularly for those corporate leaders that know that they need to move in a new direction. And they're kind of looking for the parameters to be able to do that. So I think this is not just an NGO discussion. It's not just a political discussion, but it's also not just a grassroots discussion. Potentially, there is also a corporate angle that can come into this as well.
Yeah,
So.
and I think this is where the work that you're doing really connects with what we're trying to do at the Future Law Institute, because we are trying to support lawyers and advocates and policy entrepreneurs around the world who want to identify and work on strategic intervention points in the system that can really make progress to get access to the narratives and the learning and the understanding to be able to progress it in their local jurisdiction. So we're really excited about supporting the Stop Ecocide movement and developing a community of practice with you around this area.
Oh, that would be absolutely fantastic. Obviously, I think that's an incredibly exciting arena that can open up there. Definitely. Yeah. I think that's hugely exciting.
Yeah. I don't know. Do we have any questions? Do we have any questions from the audience?
Nothing in here just yet.
Okay.
Double check.
Okay.
I think an interesting aspect of this that kind of goes back again to what Kate was saying about the moral side of people's kind of understanding that there is something that needs to be done about this. It's the right thing to do is to prevent further devastation from taking place. And I think that it's worth kind of highlighting that in our kind of dominant Western paradigm, if you like, it's criminal law that is used to draw a moral line. That's how we kind of that's where we say this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. And that's something that the civil litigation side that Kate was elaborating earlier doesn't really touch in the same way. So you can't go to your government and ask for a permit to kill a few hundred people in order to achieve your business aims, because you can't do that. It's a crime. It's completely accepted. It's totally morally wrong. But you can do that if you want to, open a mine, or you want to drill for oil. You can go get a permit for it. So it's because it's still in the kind of regulatory sphere. It's not in the sphere of morality in the public consciousness. And literally in the law. So then those two things kind of overlap very strongly. I feel that that kind of the moral red line, we use criminal law to draw that. And so there's this sense that by taking environmental destruction below that red line, you're actually creating a kind of cultural shift, a mindset shift as well around it. And that's really important. And the other thing that I really wanted to acknowledge from what Kate was saying earlier was that she's absolutely right. We're under no illusion that ecocide law is going to fix the entirety of the mess we're in, but it's this kind of key. It's like a key bridging piece, because it's like without this kind of a legal parameter being put in place, it's difficult to see how all the other fantastic initiatives that are being initiated around the world can really cohere and work in time. To make the difference that we need to make. This is kind of a key piece that needs to be put in as a foundational piece in order to enable other things. So your term, I love your term of strategic intervention in that context.
It definitely is one. I'm seeing we have a question from Ross Cook. Would a law against ecocide, a question I cannot answer, would a law against ecocide enforce the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons that is now due to become law very soon as a human rights and an existential environmental issue? This also needs a community of practice. Will you head it up, Ross? Yeah, so Kate?
Shall I answer? Yeah. So I saw that question. That's hi, Ross. So there's an interesting, what that made me think of actually, I'll try and answer the question, but so Jojo mentioned that under consideration for the Rome Statute was some kind of ecocide type crime, right? Prohibition of environmental destruction. It's actually been previously considered at the International Law Commission, which is, for anybody that doesn't know, is the kind of the UN's legal bigwigs who codify new law and work on new treaties and so on. And when considering in a number of different projects, the draft code of crimes against the peace and security of mankind, which mutated perhaps into the Rome Statute, but also the articles on state responsibility, some sort of ecocide crime was considered there as well. And it's thought, some of the people involved have written articles which have suggested that the reason that didn't go forward was opposition from nuclear states, because they thought that it would impact on their ability to remain nuclear powers. So I think without a doubt, there's obviously a law against ecocide would prohibit, you know, certainly the use of nuclear weapons. It wouldn't deal with, you know, and until they were used, of course, it wouldn't capture it, because it would be a criminal law which would come into effect, you know, after the act had been committed. So there's a really clear link in the history, as well as you know, in our future speculation, between use of nuclear weapons and ecocide, without a doubt. And in fact, a lot of the thinking, just thinking about something else, a lot of the thinking around ecocide originally developed in the 70s after the use of Agent Orange in Vietnam. I mean, it's not a nuclear weapon, but the use of weapons, you know, it came around through thinking about warfare and prohibiting certain weapons. And in fact, there is, in the laws of war, there is a prohibition on the use of weapons which impact the environment. The problem with that is it's only applicable in the situation of international armed conflict. So it doesn't address actually the major drivers, you know, the major pollution incidents and climate change drivers that we have going on today, like fossil fuel companies and so on.
Thank you.
Ross, did you want to say?
Yeah, no, I think Polly also saw the obvious overlaps and knew the history of it, to the point I almost hesitated to ask here. But I think it's a very exciting moment, as the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons is about to achieve its 50th ratification and will enter into law next year. How this moment coincides in terms of everything that you've been saying. I was very interested to have your opinion as a lawyer on it, because the grassroots movement seemed to me very parallel in terms of the states affected as well by nuclear testing and the nuclear colonialism that's gone on. So I'm very excited to discover just today, because of Jojo speaking, really, that this summit is happening and that there are these communities that were mentioned, because I would like people to be aware that is a very urgent and current topical way to prevent horrible catastrophe and environmental destruction that needs to be included in people's minds. And I hope that that's a productive thought, because there's been so much kind of I don't know, confusion about nuclear weapons actually providing some kind of defense. So that it may cloud the issue for a lot of people, I'm not sure, but it's quite clear to me.
Yeah, really helpful.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, Ross. I'm seeing quite a few questions coming in now.
I can't read them through here, so
yeah, yeah. We have one from Vincent, who is saying, who would be the addressees of the Ecocide clause you're drafting? We kind of covered it before, but we can answer it for him. State actors, corporations, or individuals?
Yeah, so it's essentially aimed at individuals, and that's how international criminal law works at the moment. And it is so it's just like if you're prosecuting genocide, it's not the foot soldiers you prosecute, it's the controlling minds. So the same would be true of Ecocide. So you'd be looking at the CEOs making the decisions, potentially government ministers issuing permits or putting policies, but also potentially financiers, people, effectively, and insurers. I mean, you can't insure an activity that's criminal. So, those are that's the sort of level at which you're acting. It's not like, I mean, we often get people saying, am I committing ecocide by driving my car, my fossil fuel car? Now, of course, there's a minuscule percentage to which you're contributing, but ultimately you're actually probably not driving your fossil fuel car because you've thought about those options. Those options have been made available to you by those at the top of industry and government who are making those decisions as to what to subsidize, what to promote, what policies to put in place. So it's not the end users that this is aimed at, it's aimed at the controlling minds and specifically individuals. And it has a sort of slightly different kind of quality to the effect of it. It has a different deterrent effect, perhaps, we'd like to think, compared to other international crimes. Now, I'm fairly sure there's no such thing as an average genocidal maniac, but if there were, I can't imagine that they would be concerned about their public image. Whereas your average CEO cares very deeply about their public image. They don't want to be thought of alongside war criminals or genocidal maniacs. Effectively, their share price depends on, public and investor confidence. So there is a level at which criminalizing ecocide has a deterrent potential, which is very strong in its own right.
That is so interesting, because we were just having a panel discussion with Dominic Hofstetter and Dr. Mehta. And they were actually saying, we were addressing the fact that Bill Gates just issued his own plan, announced it a couple of days ago that he's going to be investing into the climate change. And then Jeff Bezos, earlier this year, he also announced that he's going to be investing $10 billion into the climate change. And I was asking them what their perspective was on that. And they simply said, well, it doesn't really do much if you just put a lot of money into the system, if you don't do systematic change within your own ecosystem. So they were basically suggesting that, it's almost as if somebody's paying to be, to kind of change his reputation. So it's, I paid for that, so now I'm clean. But in fact, I'm not really going to implement any changes within my company or how, the supply chain looks like, but I paid. So what you're saying very much resonates. I mean, the CEOs are definitely taking care of their image, absolutely. And this is possibly why they are putting so many funds into the space. But it's going to be also about what do they do, whether they do some, eat your own dog food scenarios. I mean, nevertheless, absolutely. They will have to take care of their own companies first and only then take care of the whole environment and ecosystem.
There was an interesting study apparently done, I think it was Colorado University, but I need to go back and check the detail, but where they had a look at, there was some research done around changing the law and what effect that had at the corporate level, and the conclusion was something along the lines of, if you change regulation, you don't change corporate behavior, you simply change corporate budgeting. Whereas if you change criminal law, you actually start changing behavior. So that's, I think that kind of has an echo of what you're just saying.
It's almost like a sanction lingering on top of them. It's almost like GDPR. I mean, all of a sudden we have these huge sanctions for the companies, and companies have to adapt. Okay.
Yeah, very much so. And the nice thing about, well, nice is an inadequate word, but the procedure at the International Criminal Court, the fact that it has these stages and therefore it has a certain length of time it takes, it's almost like the GDPR. It's almost like creating a compliance period and saying, okay, this may not be here right now, but this is now in motion, and in a few years' time, by that point, you're going to have adapted your practices to this new set of rules.
I realize we don't have very much time left, but we do have a couple of questions. Maybe I'll read them out, and if Kate or Jojo can answer quickly. Gavni is asking, how much do you both already integrate design as part of your communication strategy? Not sure who both is there. Is it Future Law and is it Kate? Right? But how much do you both integrate design as part of your communication strategy in reaching multiple institutes, politics, but also the public crowd? Do you believe creating that the new narrative should be supported by clear design that speaks many languages and reaches many hearts around the world? Also for the people not in law to understand the importance of it?
Yes.
I mean, I would say in principle, absolutely, yes.
Yeah, Gavni, we're with you. Okay, they've taken the questions off my screen, so I think tech is telling me I need to not read any more questions. Is that it?
But maybe, I mean, we do invite everybody to join us on LinkedIn. We do have a group, and we also have a group for Future Law on WhatsApp. So Please, I mean, post those questions in there. We'll do our best to actually answer and follow up with them.
Yeah, sure. So thank you, Jojo. Thank you, Kate. We've come to the end of this panel discussion. Really very stimulating and, you know, also very hopeful. Very hopeful discussion that we're in a moment where the momentum is there and this can be something within the next 18 to 24 months, you know. That,
certainly hope so.
so thank you very much for being here and joining us at the Future Law.
Thank you,
Right,
Margaret.
so next follow-up.
There you go.
Thank you very much, and also thank you for to everybody in the audience. I mean, you've been with us for numerous days. It's the closing round, but we have the final day now, and are going to be entering the collaborative journey, and then having some closure remarks. Stay with us because after the closing remarks, we still do have some labs. And there's going to be Nisha Rahu telling us more about the Singapore, and after that there's going to also be Tessa Manuelo talking about the law and design. So keep an eye on the schedule, stay with us, and welcome to our next sessions.
And Kareem, I think we'll take it over from here.